Hi everyone, in today's video we're going to talk about market research. So I'm going to go through some different vocab and then I'm going to talk about some examples, and then at the very end we're going to just touch briefly on a few very basic interview tips. And I'm not talking interview meaning like you're interviewing for a job. I'm talking about interviewing to get data from your customers or to get information from your customers. All right, so today's objective, you will be able to define the research objective of your final paper. Okay, let's get going. So what is market research? Market research gives us the data, the facts, the voice of the customer, so marketers can make decisions based on information, not just guessing. So one of the things we want to think about in market research is not only what types of market research there are, but we really want to think about getting both sides. So in the beginning here, we're going to go over 4 different vocabulary words. The first one's primary research, and the second one is secondary research. So what is it? We're going to do a quick start here with secondary research. Secondary research is basically the research you've probably done for every single paper you wrote in high school and college, and then even in graduate school. They're all pretty much the same. This is the type of research where you're going out generally on Google and you're looking for different articles that have been written. You're looking for different statistics that have been collected by other companies. This is data that already exists. It's there, and you're taking it and you're using it. You're maybe even kind of manipulating it to support what you want to find. This is the research that basically all of us do every single day for the most part. The benefit of this, of course, is that it's extremely quick. And it's usually free, or it's very affordable compared to collecting your own data. So even if it's expensive, right, you're hiring some sort of research company to get their data, it's still going to be much cheaper than doing specific research for this problem that you're trying to solve. And that's the benefit of doing secondary research. The problem of secondary research, though, is that the data was collected to support a different problem. It wasn't collected to support the actual problem you're looking for. So you're sort of bending it to fit what you want. You don't actually know why it was collected in the first place or what the purpose of it was in the first place. And so it's not 100% accurate in the sense of like I said, you're sort of like piecing different data together to solve the problem that you're trying to find. It's not for you. And that's why it's cheap or it's free. And that's why it's very quick to find, because it's already been done. When you compare that to primary research is research that you are doing specifically for this. You're doing all of the research yourself. So if you do it well, you know it's 100% for this problem. So you know it should be extremely accurate. These are things like surveys, focus groups, website and questionnaires, or website data and questionnaires. The problem with this, though, it's expensive. You have to pay people to do it. Think about yourself. Have you ever filled out a survey? Every time you fill out a survey, you've probably been paid. Or you get some sort of like gift, or you get a gift card or something like that. There's always something that they're giving you for your time and energy. That costs money. Now imagine to you, it's only $25, it's $50, it's $100, whatever it is. But to get good data, you should do, 100, 500, maybe even 1,000 people. That's a lot to get really good data. That adds up. Also, you have to have experts who are conducting this research. You have to have people who really know what they're doing so that you get good quality research from what you're trying to do. The other thing is collecting 1,000 different surveys or having focus groups or whatever it is, coming up with the plans, collecting all the data, crunching the numbers, figuring out what it means, implementing it. All of this takes time. It takes a long time. And so the downfall of primary data, the biggest too, is that it's really expensive and it takes a long time to do. And so when you compare that to secondary data, the data's already been collected. And so it's right there for you. It doesn't take nearly as much time. And as I said, it's much cheaper, but it's not as accurate. And so these are things that you have to weigh. Do you have the time? Do you have the money to go for it? Then doing primary is going to be more beneficial because it's probably going to be much more accurate. If you're on a tight budget or you're on a time crunch, then secondary data is better. And that's why students generally are using secondary data And hopefully when you go into a company situation, you can spend more time and energy and actually do primary research for yourself. The second two types of vocabulary we're going to talk about is qualitative and quantitative. So the first one we're going to talk about is qualitative. To me, what's interesting is that in market research, for the first how many years, everything was focused mostly on qualitative research. Qualitative research is, to me, is like the big picture. It's sort of it's what are people thinking about? This is really, really difficult to get. The thing with qualitative data, though, is that you have to talk to people. You have to observe people. You have to watch them. You have to have focus groups. You have to get inside of their mind and think about what are they thinking about. The other problem with qualitative data, though, is that when you ask people, why did you buy this? Or what's the difference between this one and that one? Most of us don't actually know. We don't think about it. Think about yourself. Most decisions you make, most things you buy, you're really unaware of why you're buying them. You like it. That's it. You don't really go into it. And so as a researcher, you need to really get in there and think about why are they really doing these things? And so if you remember the other video that talked about with the Clay Christensen, he talked about what job are you hiring this product to do? That's like an idea of trying to understand that the qualitative side. So the qualitative side, though, to me, recently is starting to be more neglected. And I think the focus on universities or in businesses or in pro sports, everyone is really, really focused on this quantitative, the data side. And yes, data is important, but you must have qualitative data. You have to understand the why. The numbers don't tell you the why. And so if you think about the other side, the quantitative data is numbers. This is the big data, right? So I always think about it this way. Quantitative data will get you, will get someone on your website. You can use the numbers to sort of understand the path that people are going. And the sense of you can get it almost there, right? You can see how many clicks you get here. You can see how many clicks you get there. Or, in sports, that a three-pointer is worth more than a two-pointer. That they shoot from this position, they get, this percentage conversion rates. All this stuff, whether it's sports or business. Quantitative will get you there. Qualitative research is the part that closes the deal. So you have to understand the why. Why does this color different than that color? A person needs to make the actual three-point shot, right? So this kind of stuff is really, really important. So it should really be a 50%, 50%, qualitative and quantitative. It shouldn't be all quantitative or it shouldn't be all qualitative. And so when you're coming up with your research, you need to make sure, are we getting roughly 50% of our data from qualitative? And are we getting roughly 50% of our data from quantitative? If you're doing both, you're on a good path and you're increasing your odds of success. So for me, the example I use for quantitative is Moneyball. I think Moneyball by Michael Lewis is a great book. It's a great movie. And if you watch it with Brad Pitt, right, it's a wonderful movie that gets into kind of the beginning of analytics in baseball. And to me, sports and how they do research and scouting is very similar to market research and understanding how you can improve your business. So if you haven't seen the movie Moneyball, it's a movie I strongly recommend, because it does a great job of talking about how they use quantitative data. But what's funny, though, is that the other pro teams and the other analysts are giving a lot of pushback because they're saying qualitative data is actually more important. And this movie's older. This actually takes place in 2000s, the early 2000s. And then I think around the 2010s, the late 2010s, there was sort of a push that became over heavy on analytics. And now we're in the 2020s. And we're starting to come back, and I think it's getting more around the 50-50 point, like I said a few minutes ago. I just have this video in here. I'm not going to include this video. To me, cookies and data analytics have really exploded simply because of online shopping, right? Online shopping, the beauty of it is that everything is trackable. Everything is countable. And so it's completely changed. And so if you look up this video, it's called Open Source and talks about the history of cookies, which basically was the beginning of this massive collection of data that companies were able to get, whether you're a big company or a small company. And it completely changed the way we view shopping. So now I want to give you this example and it's based off a quote. So Steve Jobs, there's a famous quote that Steve Jobs is always quoted as saying, "People don't know what they want until you show it to them. That's why I never rely on market research. Our task is to read things that are not yet on the page." First of all, if you've ever read the Steve Jobs book by Isaac, I think it was Newtonson, if you have his book, I strongly recommend you read that book. It's a wonderful book. It's an absolutely fantastic book. He gets into Steve Jobs' life, and you also learn about all the different things that he was a part of, which he was a part of basically everything in the beginning of the internet world. But I want to give you a story of why I think this quote is misleading. Right? I think a lot of people, and this is my experience of teaching this class for many years in person, and people would always say, well, why do I need to do market research if Steve Jobs didn't need to do market research? He just understood it, and I think we don't need to do the same thing. I think that's kind of an incorrect way of looking at this quote, and I'm going to give you an idea of how Steve Jobs came up with this and how he was able to come up with the iPod, which ultimately led to the iPhone and the iPad. Right, so it's a bit of a history lesson, but I think it's a wonderful example. So for those of you that are older, you were there. You were part of this. For those of you that were younger, you weren't there. And I'm just going to walk you through how he came about this. So did he do market research in the sense of like he went out and surveyed customers? No, he didn't. But he was able to read what was happening in front of him through observation and come up with products that will make their lives better for us consumers. So here we go. So if you go all the way back to the 1980s. So in the 1980s, everybody had a Walkman. It was a tape deck. This is before the CD player. The Walkman was like a game changer. It changed everyone's lives because now you could put headphones on, you could walk around, you could exercise, you could play sports, and you could listen to music. This was an absolute game changer. The Walkman was hugely popular through the 80s. Part of the 90s, but then in the 90s, this thing called the Discman came. The Discman was pretty terrible. The reason a Discman was terrible was because you had to carry it like this. If you turned it upside down, the music would stop, it would skip, and it would lose, and sometimes it would start all the way over. So in theory, it was great because everyone had discs, CD players in their cars and their houses, but the actual Discman itself, the portable one, was pretty terrible. So people were still actually using a Walkman, even though tapes had become kind of obsolete. People were still using them because, like I said, a Discman just wasn't that comfortable. But then the MP3 player came. This was huge. The MP3 player came out in the late 90s. I was actually in college when the MP3 player came out. It was the very, very beginning. I remember people being in their dorms and we would spend hours and hours and hours downloading music for the first time from the internet. The thing is, though, there was no iTunes. There was no place where you could go and get good music. So you'd have to find these kind of pirated, cheesy websites, and people would download multiple versions of the same song because most versions that you downloaded were terrible quality. And so now you had all this music, but the music, you could either burn it on a CD or you could put it in an MP3 player. But the MP3 players, the lifespan of the MP3 player was really, really short because most of them were actually pretty terrible quality. So here's an example I just found on the internet. And I don't actually know anybody that had one because the quality was just very poor. People were still sort of using Discmans and Walkmans, and then on their computer, they would listen to MP3s. Then the crazy company called Napster came along. It was founded in 1999 as a pioneering peer-to-peer file-sharing internet software that emphasized sharing digital audio files, typically audio songs, and coded in MP3 format. If you go down history lane, Napster was like, it changed the music industry because now there was a place where everybody could go and get this music. Of course, as you know, the music industry freaked out because it was all pirated music and everyone across the world was on Napster downloading music without paying for it. But it was finally a place where high quality music was being uploaded in an MP3 format and everybody could download it. So now you can kind of see where we're going. Now we're online. We have this place. Music is not being good. The music industry is being actually cut out. It's not being regulated, so the music industry is not getting paid, but also the quality is not being regulated. This is where Steve Jobs stepped in. He came in and he saw this mess going on, and he invented iTunes. He said, why don't we make a music library that's online that people pay? So all the music companies, the producers actually get money, and the customers are happy because they don't have to search and download multiple files to find a good one. Every single one is high quality. Then what he did was he came out and he made a high quality iPod or an MP3 player, which absolutely changed the market. So he made two huge changes just by observing the marketplace. One was iTunes, and two is the MP3 player called the iPod. Imagine walking through an airport in the early to mid 2000s. People had big, huge, clunky laptops. People had Blackberries that were, they weren't touchscreens. They just had Blackberries. They had Kindles. They had maybe some like iRiver video player. They had all this stuff, like all these different kinds of electronics. Again, Steve Jobs walked to all he has to do is walk to the airport and he can see, why can't we put all of this onto one machine? Why can't everything that everyone is carrying with them be in one machine? And that's the beginning of the iPad, which then led to the iPhone, right? And so the reason I share this story with you is because, he didn't do the sense of go out and survey people or have focus groups, but he was observing the marketplace. He was watching what was taking place in society, and he was able to come up with products that made our lives better. And that's how he did his market research. And that's why he was a genius, because he was able to see what was happening and he was able to improve through these things. But I think this is really, really important. It's something that you should take yourself. You don't always have to do, surveys and focus groups. A lot of it is just observing people in the marketplace and seeing what are they doing and what difficulties are they having and how can I make changes in those areas to improve their lives. So this is actually from a recent video I saw from two younger creators on YouTube. They're massive, but I think I was listening to it. They were in an interview, and it just blew my mind when they actually said this quote. And it said, innovation is just plagiarism with style. I thought that was a wonderful quote. And I think it's perfect, right? Like, not everyone is reinventing all this new stuff or inventing all this new stuff. Basically, they're just reinventing things that exist and making it better. But I thought this was a wonderful quote by these two guys, Tommy in a wheelbarrow suit. They're super young. They're like 19, 20 years old when they said it in the interview, but it's so perfect. Innovation is just plagiarism with style. All right, now we're going to kind of shift on to market research and why you need it. So why do you need market research? What do our customers want and need? Of course you need to know that. What do we do best? How do we need to improve it? Figuring out how these customers view us, right? And what does our company mean to our consumers? So everything on this page, we're not going to talk about it here. I'm not even going to go over it. These are other videos that I've produced that you can watch on my webpage. Or go ahead and watch all these and we'll answer all these questions. So we're just going to cruise on. The question then becomes is what research? Where do we start? Right? So now we talked about why you need research, why it's so important. Two different types of kind of research, primary and secondary. Then we talked about qualitative and quantitative. But research, where do we start? The most important thing is step number one. In step number one, you need to define the problem. What is your objective? What are you trying to prove? Right? You need to try to prove, is something right or something wrong? You need to do research and you need to think about what is the objective. If you don't have an objective, you're just sort of blindly walking. What is your hypothesis? What is your problem that you're trying to solve? That is by far the most important step. It is step number one. If you don't do this, you're just blindly going out there looking at stuff. You need something to guide you. And then step number two, develop the research plan. Like, what kind of plan are you going to do? What type of methodology makes the most sense? Step number three, now you got to collect data, right? Start collecting your data. Get out there, get your hands dirty, start getting your information. Now, step number four, what did we find, right? Because when you do good research, you're going to have way too much data. But one of the most difficult parts of doing research is that what is actually important from that data? What did you actually pull from there? And you really want to think about, you want to try to view this data from a neutral point of view and not just only looking for something that supports your thoughts, which we all know, if no matter what you're thinking, you can go on the internet and you can find someone else that's thinking the same thing. that will support your thoughts. That's extremely easy. So you need to look at it from both sides, and you need to get what's actually important. And then number 5, which is just take action. All right, here's a couple tips. Observe the essence of the shopping and brand experience. Your job is to be a researcher who is looking, listening, and observing all that is happening around you. The key to me is just standing back. That's often the most important thing, which is not easy. Just looking, listening, and observing, and you can learn a lot about life if you just do those 3 things. Another thing is watch your competitors. What are your competitors doing? What are they up to? How do people view their products? If you just do that, you can learn a lot. Here's the last part of our lesson. This is just a couple basic interviews. Again, these are interviews not like going for a job interview. These are interviews you collecting data. And the reason I share this with you is this is from my own experience. Interviews are difficult. It's much more difficult than most of us think. If you are someone who has actually done interviews, you understand the first couple times you did it, like, whoa, that was way more difficult than I thought. I think we all think like, of course I can interview people. But then we realize like it's actually a skill. Being a good interviewer is a very, very real skill. And it's one that most of us don't have. So here's a couple tips to start out with to become a good interviewer. Use the funnel approach. Start with general questions that are easy to answer to more specific and personal at the end. Make sure to ask open-ended questions instead of questions with yes or no. Follow up with questions to get deeper, right? So I'm going to give you a couple examples here. The first one, what I mean by that is this. You want to start out with broad questions. What I mean by broad questions is very easy questions. You want to get them comfortable. Think about it. Even if you meet someone in your class or someone at work for the first time and they ask you something very personal, how do you feel? You immediately clam up. You're like, don't talk to me, right? But if you ask very broad, comfortable, easy questions, you get them they become more comfortable with you. As they become more comfortable with you, they will share more information. So then your questions become a little more focused, maybe slightly a little more personal. The second tip is called laddering, which is just why, right? To dig deeper, to get them to, because people usually start out with something very basic. So the more you ask why, the deeper they get, the more you can learn from them. This is a movie clip. It's one of my favorites. I'll put this clip down below. It's a great clip to watch. It's actually from, I think, a classic movie, Uncle Buck. This was made in the 80s. Macaulay Culkin's first movie. This is before Home Alone. He does a great job in here of interviewing. It's pretty funny. A couple things here. I'm not going to actually go over this. I'm just going to give you this tip here. You can read these on your own. The most important thing is this. When you interview somebody, it's an interview. It's not a conversation. And what I mean by that is this. Think about yourself every time you go to lunch with a friend or your partner, whatever it is. What do? Your partner talks, you talk. They talk, you talk. And think about what you're thinking about during this process. While they're telling their story, you're thinking about your story that you're going to tell next. You're not one-upping them, but you're sharing a mutual story. They tell a story, you're thinking, okay, you tell a story. They tell a story, you're thinking, you tell your story. That's a conversation. Think about an interview. They tell their story, you listen. When they're done, you ask a follow-up question. They tell their story, you listen. When they're done, you ask a follow-up question. You don't share your story because when you share your story, you start guiding the conversation or the interview into the direction that you want it to go. It's not about you, it's about them. But generally in conversations, it's a 50-50, if not more about you than it is about them. That's just how we are. We're selfish people, right? So at the most, it's a 50-50. In an interview, it's all them, zero you. And that's a really, really, really hard thing to break because it's not natural. That's why when you watch people on TV or YouTube, really good interviewers, they ask a question and they listen, right? And then we've all seen people, especially on late night TV, most of them are terrible at interviewing and they're always trying to jam their thoughts down and they'll actually cut the person off. They'll cut the guest off to tell their own story. And if you pay attention, it's really annoying because you see like, hey, the guest, you'll even see the guests start to get annoyed because they're not actually getting an opportunity to share their story, right? And so this is something that you have to work on and something you have to remind yourself while you're doing the interview process, all right? So hopefully you'll be able to define the research objective of your final paper today. Hopefully you learn some basics about market research and it will help you out. All right, thanks. Have a great day. Take care. Bye.